Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
Paris provided an example and a reference point for other cities that are thinking about this relationship between their communities and their urban waterways and asking fundamental questions about how do we live in cities.
How did the Paris Olympics influence other cities to make their waterways swimmable? This week's show is all about our relationship with water in our cities. We'll explore a new initiative looking to get more urban centres on board with allowing their citizens the possibility to take a dip within city limits. And also, we delve into the transformation of London's Battersea Power Station and how it has created a new area on the waterfront of the British capital. All that and more ahead in the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. If there's one thing that the 2024 Paris Olympic Games taught us about improving our cities, it might be that cleaning up urban waterways so that citizens can and will be inclined to take a dip can be a tricky process. What we know for sure is that the result, an urban oasis built for aquatic activity, is a boon to any public realm. So how do we encourage more cities to take up the baton and make swimmable spaces for all? Melbourne-based Matt Sykes is an Australian urban thinker and landscape architect and the co-founder and convenor of Swimmable Cities, an initiative from his company Regeneration Projects. They're campaigning to make at least 30 cities swimmable by 2030. So we invited Matt onto the show to tell me more about their methods and their ambitions.
Swimmable Cities is about empowering activists, actors and decision makers in the international urban swimming movement. So just before the 2024 Paris Olympics, we helped kickstart a platform and in particular launched a charter which involves 10 principles that starts with the right to swim, that safe, healthy urban waterways should be accessible to all people, and it maps out a series of other dimensions that also integrate the rights of nature. So now we have signatories from organisations spread out between over 50 cities and over 22 countries around the world.
Now tell me, you said this launched ahead of the Paris Olympics. We saw in Paris the very complicated attempts to make the Seine swimmable. What's your role in something like that? Were you using that as a benchmark for what you wanted other cities to aspire to?
I think Paris provided an example and a reference point for other cities that are thinking about this relationship between their communities and their urban waterways and just asking fundamental questions about how do we live in cities. And as we become more urbanized, as we navigate a warming climate, how do we adapt? And so for us, the City of Paris and Mayor Hidalgo's leadership was really, a prime example of people that are really sticking up for not only the right to swim, but improve livability in urban waterways. And so we were there to shine a spotlight on that and to also then start to create a community of more advanced actors and participants in this movement internationally. But more importantly, those that are looking to get more involved and to help transformations happen in their own home cities and waterways.
And tell me, how did it all begin? You're in Melbourne. Did this start in Melbourne? Did it start with Matt, the man who likes to jump in a river? Did it begin with a personal story? How did this start?
Yeah, so like many movements, they have lots of different tributaries, let's say, and then confluence points. So for me personally, going back to 2011, I was visiting Zurich for an international landscape architecture conference. And I remember walking down the streets. It was during summer and I heard splashing, in the background. And for me, coming from Melbourne, that was a really strange sound because of course we love our beaches and so on, but people swimming in a city, that's really strange. And so I soon discovered that that was a bathhouse, and then, weeks later was traveling through Copenhagen and seeing the harbour baths, and it really just planted a seed about what's possible. So fast forward and working in different spaces, including in the hot springs and bathing tourism industry here in Australia, I started to connect with colleagues that were overseas and seeing them, start to create transformations in their urban waterways, and still it remained this kind of elusive goal. But toward the end of last year, we published through my business, Regeneration Projects, a Swimmable Cities handbook that would start to articulate some of the typologies of the different urban swimming experiences, and also the different actors, what they're motivated by, what are the challenges. And one of the recommendations at the end of the handbook was to form a international alliance and steering committee that could start to support international cooperation in this space. So fast forward into 2024, February happened to be on Valentine's Day. We always like to say that it's perhaps for a love of water and a love of swimming. A small group of us got together and we formed this steering committee. So representatives from Vienna, London, France, Berlin. And then out of that, we were asking ourselves, what can we contribute in this pivotal once in a generation year? And what we came up with were the bones of a Swimmable Cities charter. And out of that, we then started circulating that within the community. And then quickly it started to snowball, so that when we dropped it just before the Paris Olympics, there was this noticeable momentum. And then social media helped catalyze it, and also the media in general, which has been incredible to be part of. And now it's a matter of what next, and helping to put tools in people's hands.
Well, as a company that has offices in Zurich, I warn you, if you go to our office, especially in the summer, before you know what's happened, they'll have you in a pair of trunks diving in the water. I'm resistant come winter, but in summer, it's certainly a city that has embraced its water. Now, just tell me, you're convening and you're nudging and cajoling people to think about this, but, I guess in many city halls, they probably think they have a plan already. So is your intention not to be advising them in minutiae about what they do, but making sure that the conversation remains ongoing, and that maybe you link these cities together so that people are sharing best practice, as you said?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what officers and decision makers within municipalities are looking for are handholds and innovative ways that they can speak to their climate action goals, their nature positive aspirations, but also community well-being, and let's call it regenerative economies. So an example here close to home in Melbourne, we were working with the city of Yarra and engaging with their former mayor and councillors who are very, very passionate about connecting with the Yarra River, or for our Indigenous peoples here, we call it the Birrarung. And for them, the charter became a very tangible tool that they could start to align with their new climate emergency plan. So I was there in their, city hall just before they were about to launch this new climate emergency plan. And they were pointing to all of these different handholds. And then within the same meeting, one of their first actions after endorsing this new plan was to then become a signatory to the Swimmable Cities Charter. So I think that's exciting from a governance and a policy making perspective. We've also been in touch with other municipalities internationally from really iconic cities who are now starting to ask themselves, if Paris did it, why can't we? And so the charter and some of our networks are providing guidance that's now shaping water policy and urban design policy in other cities around the world, which I think is the beginning of a new wave of momentum.
And tell me, you say that this is about the climate emergency, which is, of course, is important, but you also stress this is actually about urban regeneration, jobs, revenue, that if done well, this can actually boost a city's coffers.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just traveling through Europe on a tour to build momentum towards a Swimmable Cities Summit that we're planning with the City of Paris and the UN Environment Programme next year. And one of the places that I was visiting was Helsinki, and there are a number of projects there where they had very strategically planted urban swimming infrastructure as a catalyst for broader urban regeneration processes. So there's one particular spot, Loilu. To be honest, I actually think I might have come across that project in a Monocle magazine originally, but beautiful architecture, a combination of sauna as well as cafe, bar, hospitality. But that was anchored there probably years, if not a decade, before housing and other mixed-use development was starting to be laid in the adjacent neighbourhoods. So you had this cleanup of the urban waterfront, you had this access, you had, walking, cycling, recreation facilities start to be planted. But this is part of a broader urban regeneration strategy. And another place in the city there, the Alas Sea Pool, was also part of a waterfront activation. And sometimes what we're seeing is sometimes it's a pop-up type experience, and that also has hospitality and tourism or housing infrastructure connected to it. But then people like it so much that they want to keep it. In Copenhagen, we've seen really good examples where housing development and mixed-use development models are incorporating urban bathing facilities as well. So that just becomes cultural. So I think we can see that, cleaning up urban waterways, making them accessible, makes good business sense as well.
And tell me before you go, if you want to strip off on a spring day in Melbourne, is there anywhere that you can dive in the Yarra? Where's the nearest place that you can experience something close to an urban swim?
Yeah, there's a stunning location, a short ride out of the city called Deep Rock. Incredible swimming spot. It's home to a local group called the Yarra Yabbies, and they, started to foster this urban swimming culture, on the back of COVID-19 and lockdown experiences. But it's a gorgeous spot, iconically Australian eucalypts, and you wouldn't imagine that you're right next door to the middle of our CBD.
I think we should probably be heading your way. Actually, before I let you go, an inspiring conversation. Let's just give people who are listening who think, damn, I need to get involved. What do they need to do?
So jump on swimmableCities.org and you'll see our charter there. We've got an open call for becoming a Swimmable Cities Charter signatory, and also keep an eye out on our socials for an update around timings for our Swimmable Cities Summit next year, 2025. That's going to be an awesome opportunity for experts, actors, activists, urbanists, all kinds of people across society that are passionate about cleaning up our urban waterways, but also getting involved themselves and using their own unique superpowers.
My thanks there to Matt Sykes for joining me on The Urbanist. Sticking with waterside development, London's famous Battersea Power Station refurbishment was completed back in 2022 by architecture studio Wilkinsoneyre. Sebastien Ricard is a director at the company, and he was in charge of the mammoth transformation of this protected building. The result is a stunning mixed-use development, which includes residential, office, retail and entertainment, delivering successful placemaking and creating a campus-like quality. Sebastien recently joined Monocle's Carlotta Rebello in studio, and Carlotta began by asking about the core values that underpin the work that his practice does.
That's a very wide-ranging question, and I think for architects it's kind of a very important question to define. So I think we all started in the office through our love of architecture and engineering and kind of mixing engineering and art. And what I mean by that is a lot of us started in the office through transportation projects. So the major project we started with were the Jubilee Line project. So we all have a background in kind of enjoying the relationship with art or architecture and engineering. So we all have this kind of hands-on approach of trying to resolve technology problem or technical problem. So that's the kind of background, and I'm talking about the early 90s, mid-90s. Of course, the practice has evolved a lot since, but I think what really is the core value for us, I would say, is learning, understanding and respecting a context. And again, learning, understanding and respecting a brief and a client and trying to go beyond. So trying to basically, hopefully, the thing we can bring as architect is, hopefully, if we're lucky and if we are successful, is to bring this kind of magic where you've listened to a brief, to a client, and you try to bring your own through that listening.
Well, let's turn now to one of the marquee projects, and we alluded to this in the beginning of our conversation, and it is your work at the Battersea Power Station, a work that I guess all of London and the world had been looking at and looking forward to its grand opening. And it is really refurbishing an iconic piece of not just London as a city, but of pop culture as well. I guess take me back to the beginning. What was it like when you first realized this was the challenge you had ahead of you?
Well, first of all, you get it totally right by saying it's kind of an iconic building. And actually what made it probably iconic more than other power station or kind of industrial building is the fact that it was derelict for a long time and became a ruin, really a kind of modern ruin very quickly, because the power station stopped operating in 1984, but was empty, and a succession of developers tried to do something with it, some starting to dismount or demolish some element of it. Therefore, the main roof, for instance, on the boiler house, which is the main volume, was gone. And what that meant is effectively this became a building that a lot of people romanticized around, and which was used as background for projection for amazing kind of city scale event. So I think, so to answer your question, so the first thing when I remember we were shortlisted for the competition is, the first thing is I was shown around by the client, and actually we were driving in a car to go around the site and inside the building. Just so therefore, the first thing which struck me was the scale. I mean, it's just magic and at the same time very daunting because it's such a big scale. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was how beautiful this kind of romantic modern ruin was, and making sure that somehow that feel of industrial heritage, of not over clean building, fully could be retained. I mean, that was one of the things that I felt was the most important thing, trying to make sure that whatever we do with the building, when people step in the building, they don't feel they enter in the new building.
It is important to note that this is a Grade 2 listed building, which comes with its own challenges because there's only a certain amount of things that you are allowed to do to the building. And we go back to the conversation about constraints almost. But I'm curious to hear about, the conservation approach and philosophy deployed here, because it is this mixture, as you were explaining, of paying almost homage to its past, but making sure it's not a building that's stuck in its past at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I mean, first of all, it's a Grade 2 star listed building. So what that means is, it's, as you say, it's very, very difficult to do major amendment to its external fabric. So I think we learn a lot for this project. And when I say we, it's not only the architects, not only the client, but Historic England, it's the local authority, the conservation officer, because this project was, a daunting project for everybody. A lot of people felt that this project was never going to happen, or the building was going to be demolished. So there were a bit of feeling when we were lucky enough to win the competition that was the last chance for the project to be transformed or for something to be done with it. So, as you say, Grade 2 star listed building normally means that you can't really touch the facade. You can only do minor amendment and subtle amendment to the internal and very limited evolution to the external. But a power station is a building which typically, and that's one of the biggest challenges for Historic England, is the fact that those are industrial buildings which are typically polluted, badly maintained, designed for machine but not for human beings. So in other words, there is very little daylight, very little slabs, so very difficult to transform into something else or to do a traditional restoration. So we were all very happy to try to explore how could we make sure that we make a success out of the transformation of that project. And what I mean by that is it's, obviously you want to be as ecologically friendly as you can with it, but you also want to make sure that it's sustainable as a project. In other words, whatever we do with this building is something which will give him a life for the next, 50, 100, 150 years, because actually to be sustainable is the best way to do it, in my opinion anyway. If you just demonstrate that a building is so successful that anyway, you always find a way of transforming itself for a long, long time. So I think everybody were very open about the idea of trying to adapt the building. So that was a big challenge, but also a very interesting challenge. How do you respect a building? How do you create new addition, new window, new openings, new slab into a building, but still with the underlining essential element of it, which is, it's a beautiful building. It was done by Jalki's Bescott. And how do you make sure that architecture is complementary to the original architecture?
Now, this is far from being the first historic building that you've been involved in and that the practice has been involved in. Were there some challenges here that were different from what you've encountered in the past? Were there new learnings from, as you say, a project of this scale?
Yeah, definitely. I think the scale is one thing. I don't think I've ever been involved in, and none of us have been involved in a project of that scale. And maybe we will not be involved again in a project of that scale because it's a very one-off project. So the scale is an element. I think the other element which I'm very excited about is the mix activity in the building. So the scale of each of the activity in the building is also something very unusual. I mean, there's 45,000 square meters of offices in that building. That's the scale of the gherkin. So you put the gherkin horizontally, it fits in there. And that's only 30% of the overall area. Well, there's 120 shops, there's 254 residential property in there, there's an event space, there's cinema. So all those mix of activity under one roof, I think is fascinating. Why? I mean, we were talking before we were recording about, the fact that we work in Farringdon, or offices in Farringdon. What I like about it is the mix in Farringdon, the fact that, we've learned from, the after Second World War of zoning activity, and we've all learned that actually if you mix activity, it's much vibrant for a society or for a city. And I think, in a way, Battersea has that amazing potential because of the scale of the project. You can basically recreate, you can live, you can do some sport, you can shop, you can work in one building. So I'm not saying it's the typical example because it's a very one-off project and, you can't repeat that formula. But I think it's a very interesting thing to be able to have all those activity mixed into one building.
Well, and that leads nicely to the ongoing debate ever since the pandemic that has been happening around in our cities about, the return to the city, the return, to the office, which still 4 years on, it still continues to be a debate around the world where some regions more than others struggle with getting people back. And a lot of times this is exactly what is proposed as a solution, isn't it? To invest and to make sure that buildings are made for mixed use and that you have this combination instead of just having, cities that are empty over the weekend or if the office workers are not there. Are you seeing this conversation reflected in the demands from your clients, in the sort of projects that come to you? How is that manifesting for you as a practitioner?
Definitively. I think it's the change of attitude to our working environment has totally shifted. We've got quite a few commercial project office building around the world and in the city or in central London. And the discussion there, which I find fascinating, by the way. I mean, one of the things to start with is, as architect or designer in general, very often until, I would say 4 years ago, we were pushing hard on sustainability. And we were always having to compromise a bit because very often when we were faced with cost analysis or, factor that we couldn't control, very often the client had to drive us back down a bit on our aspiration. Now, I think, first of all, what is very, very exciting is the client are pushing as hard as we are. So you could arguably say one of the reasons they're pushing hard is for marketing purposes. But frankly, if it's for marketing purposes, it doesn't matter. As long as they are pushing hard and as long as it's not greening or greenwashing, but it's fundamental good progression we can do in the building stock, and we are there to help because we are the professional. That's fundamental. So any tenant, any kind of occupier are looking at that because they want their staff, or they have to justify to their staff that actually what they're providing them as a working environment is really good. The other aspect is it's not only about working. Because of that difficulty of bringing back people to work, you have to excite people to come to work. And it's not about, if the only thing they can think about is they're going to sit at the desk and actually they're going to have 1 hour and a half to commute in a very packed tube on the way in and the same thing on the way back. That's not going to help them to feel excited to come back to work. So everything we're doing at the moment is creating some really exciting spaces for the people working. And as you say, it's about the mix of activities, making sure that if they come down at lunchtime for a sandwich, they might have the most amazing piazza at the ground floor. They will have a lot of interesting retail. They will have cultural element next to them. So it's really, really exciting. And it's also providing roofscape, providing external space, going back to naturally ventilated building, all those things which, we kind of were forced by the norm of the industry to get rid of. What I like to think is we're going to the quirkiness back of architecture. So this idea where you can create things which might not be perfect because you're restoring a building rather than doing something brand new. And you know what? You might not have floor-to-ceiling height window, which maximize the view you can have, but actually is it not so much better if actually you've got the right intensity, you've got some solid component next to you, so you can have more intimacy in your space. So all those things, I think, are bringing back some richness into the architecture.
Sebastien Ricard in conversation there with Carlotta Rebello. Lastly, we take a look at the first fully indigenous-owned department store in Canada. Mandy Sinclair sent us a report looking into the story behind Aaniin and what their success in Canada's largest city means for other indigenous brands.
The Christmas rush is on at one of Canada's busiest shopping centres, the Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto. Or Takaronto, as Anishinaabe entrepreneur Chelsea Petit would say. Takaronto is the Mohawk word for Canada's largest city and translates as the place in the water where the trees are standing. And it's here that Chelsea has opened the doors to Canada's first indigenous-owned department store. Taking up prime real estate on the second floor, the shop is complete with a jewelry counter with goods by Indigenous beadwork designers and jewelry makers, clothing, accessories, homewares, and a beauty counter. On a recent visit, Chelsea tells me that her idea for creating an Indigenous-owned department store stems from taking back the Indigenous economy.
Talk about reclaiming the Indigenous economy because it is ours to take back, and if we don't take it back, then these big corporations are going to start taking pieces of our pie, and we're just going to be colonized out of our own businesses again. At the end of the day, I feel like the whole goal is for community impact and reciprocity within our nations.
But this isn't Chelsea's first foray into retail. She launched her own clothing and athleisure wear brand Aaniin in 2021 and sold at her small shop in Toronto's Stacked Market.
It was a very small space. It was only 800 square feet, and I carried 25 other Indigenous brands, and then a lot of my own collection is still what I have available at this pop-up. Aaniin origin crew neck, which is how I came up with the idea for Aaniin. I basically was walking in the street in downtown Toronto, and I thought that I saw somebody wearing Indigenous syllabics on their shirt, but as I got closer, I realized it was actually just a triangle. In that moment, I was really excited, and I just had so many questions, what did it say, what language was it in, and obviously where could I get one? But since it wasn't what I thought it was, I decided to make my own brand, and when I chose the word Aaniin to be my name of the brand, I wasn't even thinking that there was a triangle in the syllabic translation.
Like Chelsea's fashion label, the store is also called Aaniin, which translate as hello in the Ojibwe language. I learned that Aaniin is a brand that tells stories through each piece, inviting curiosity and connection. And that's certainly related as we wandered through the department store, admiring goods from other fashion designers and brands, homewares including the top-selling eco-friendly wool blankets and shawls by Mini Teepee, delicate hand-painted pottery mugs by Mino-Ode designers, perfectly placed next to Moccasin Joe Coffee Roaster's selection of coffee, roasted on Mohawk territory, and a choice of books by Indigenous authors.
We brought in 45 other Indigenous brands and businesses to the space, so some of the new additions are books. We have a few different authors. I had one of our staff, actually, she loves reading, and I had her decide on all the books that were coming in here. She's currently taking a course at TMU, and one of the courses is actually buying. So she was able to actually put her coursework to practice and actually have her work be sold on shelves in the Eaton Centre as well.
But this pop-up department store is an opportunity too for consumers to rethink Indigenous commerce, with the store's products reflecting a decolonized approach to business, one that prioritizes economic stability, mentorship, and collaboration while uplifting Indigenous creators. After all, Canada's department store history goes back hundreds of years, when the Hudson's Bay Company was born out of the fur trade between settlers and the Indigenous communities in 1670. Indigenous people's skills and knowledge were imperative to the fur trade, an industry that was making some folks in the UK quite wealthy. With the British Empire expanding in Canada and an abundance of hunting opportunities in the new land, beaver pelts became a much sought-after item to send back to England, where goods made from these furs were in high demand for its water-repellent qualities. Trading posts along the rivers flowing into Hudson's Bay were set up for Indigenous hunters to trade with settlers. Today, the Hudson's Bay Company is the oldest and longest surviving company in North America, with bricks and mortar shops across Canada. The Aaniin pop-up here in Eaton Centre is open until December 31st, having strategically opened, Chelsea tells me, on Black Friday.
I actually was supposed to open December 1st, and I really pushed for Black Friday to open because it's the busiest time of the year, and it's also American Thanksgiving. So we should take up space in this time frame, and we should make people think about how they can become better allies and support, and most importantly, just Indigenous people can see representation on this weekend as well.
My thanks there to Mandy Sinclair for that report. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Carla Trabello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.